You're now watching Around the Horn, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is July 9th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horn, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horn.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, first we want to ask you about the 17th Annual BRICS Summit that took place this past Sunday and Monday, July 6th and 7th in Rio de Janeiro. One of the results of the summit was that the leaders of the 11 countries that make up the BRICS adopted the Rio de Janeiro Declaration, which demands greater representation for the Global South. The final text of the 17th Summit of the Expanding Bloc summarizes the diplomatic discussions of the entire year and establishes key positions on pressing international issues, including the reform of the global governance system and the search for a negotiated solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. One of the central points of the document is a, quote, comprehensive reform of the United Nations, with an emphasis on modernizing the Security Council. The stated goal is to make it more democratic, representative, and effective, incorporating greater participation from developing countries, especially those in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And headlines in the U.S. and the West in the lead-up to the summit focused on the fact that President Xi and President Putin did not attend the summit. And the summit was happening as President Trump threatened the bloc with an additional tariffs of 10% on, quote, any country that supports BRICS anti-American policies. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of the BRICS Summit that took place earlier this week in Rio?
Well, first of all, as a footnote, it gave Prime Minister Modi of India the opportunity to land in Ghana, West Africa, before jetting on to Rio de Janeiro, which will inevitably lead to a shot in the arm for the Ghanaian economy. And then returning, he landed in Windhoek, Namibia, before jetting back to his home in New Delhi. Likewise, that'll be a step forward for the Namibian economy. But I think we need to put this BRICS summit in a wider context, not only because of BRICS welcoming into its ranks a number of countries, including Indonesia, which in many ways is the big enchilada. Recall that President Prabowo of Indonesia also was in Russia in the last few weeks for the St. Petersburg Forum, which was quite extraordinary. And not to mention the fact of Bolivia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, Iran, Cuba, and others too numerous to mention. But I think that the rather frazzled Trump reaction to the BRICS summit in many ways illustrates our theme for today, which is there's this yawning gap between means and ends when it comes to U.S. imperialism. That is to say that beginning in January 2025, it was clear that Mr. Trump wanted to convert so-called allies, particularly the European Union and Japan, into neo-colonial appendages, and of course, convert Canada to the 51st state. But what United States imperialism is coming to find out is that they cannot necessarily confront BRICS by themselves. They can hardly confront China by themselves. And so likewise, they need to make concessions to the European Union and to Japan and to South Korea so that they can be on side with regard to the ultimate confrontation with China. Right now, U.S. imperialism is in a sort of gray zone. That is to say, it's in another world where it has not made this final determination that it cannot go it alone with regard to the confrontation with the BRICS, nor the confrontation with China. And so that leads to this erratic policy of Mr. Trump, which is not only a reflection of his personality, it's a reflection of the fact that U.S. imperialism is sort of trapped between means and ends. That is to say, one day he pauses weapons to Ukraine. The next day he does a 180-degree reversal. One day he's in apparent bromance with Vladimir Putin. The next day he's cursing Vladimir Putin. This is not only a reflection of Mr. Trump's own erratic behavior, but also a reflection of the vehicle which he leads. Speaking of U.S. imperialism, which cannot necessarily come to a firm determination as to what its strategy should be with regard to world domination. That is to say, does it need allies or does it need neocolonial appendages? The problem for we stuck on the ship of fools in the United States of America is that we are not as well organized, shall we say, as the BRICS, not to mention the People's Republic of China. And with regard to this big, bad, ugly bill that was just passed, a major redistribution of wealth from bottom to top, slated to gut Medicaid and healthcare, and slated to gut food stamps, etc. Also, part of the package is this massive increase in funding to the immigration authorities in the United States of America. And so therefore, you can expect more ICE raids, the likes of which we witnessed in Los Angeles of late, not to mention aggressive moves to deport undocumented workers and perhaps even documented workers for that matter to places like South Sudan, which the United States Supreme Court has just said is justifiable, and not to mention an attack on birthright citizenship, that is to say the 14th Amendment provision of the U.S. Constitution, which was slated and meant to overthrow the notorious Dred Scott decision of 1857, which said Black people could not be citizens. The Trump regime is chipping away at birthright citizenship, just like we can expect a major attack on denaturalization. That is to say, those who came to the United States but were not born here but got U.S. citizenship, their documentation will be fly-specked, and many of them can be expected to be sent abroad for good if Mr. Trump has his way. And this, of course, brings us to this major contradiction unveiled this week concerning Mr. Trump's rather scattered reaction to the BRICS Summit. Apparently, Mr. Putin did not attend because the Brazilian authorities are a signatory to the Charter of Rome, the International Criminal Court, which would have mandated, they thought, the detention of Mr. Putin if he had landed in Brazil. Interestingly enough, Benjamin Netanyahu has also been indicted by the ICC, but of course, he flew to Washington where he was embraced and of course flew over countries that could have brought down his plane if they wanted to observe the law. Mr. Xi Jinping of China apparently did not attend out of solidarity with Mr. Putin. But we really need to look at the fact that in Brazil itself, which has been just slapped with spectacular tariff hikes by Mr. Trump because of his objection to the ongoing trial of Lula da Silva, the Brazilian president, his major opponent, speaking of Mr. Bolsonaro, who sought to overthrow the results of the election a couple of years ago, apparently wanted to assassinate Lula, who had been jailed prior to the election. And Mr. Bolsonaro is facing the prospect of hard time in prison. We should realize that, interestingly enough, a base of Mr. Bolsonaro's support, and he is probably Mr. Trump's closest ally in the hemisphere, are these Protestant evangelicals, of which we are quite familiar in the United States of America. Which brings me to the point that we need our Protestant friends in the United States to put on their thinking caps and their analytical spectacles and give us a more detailed scrutiny and analysis of this Protestant evangelical trend, not least because the United States itself achieved liftoff as a so-called republic, basically as a Protestant formation. That was the kind of ruling theology in the 18th century in North America. Now, keep in mind as well that despite the criticisms of BRICS by critics who seek to attack this formation, that you have the BRICS Bank, which is led by Dilma Rousseff, a former president of Brazil. You have more trade within and amongst the BRICS nations, trade that's not conducted in the US dollar, which is the norm globally. For example, 90% plus of trade between China and Russia is not conducted in the dollar. And you also see that BRICS is marking a major milestone in terms of the big picture. That is to say, overturning, certainly eroding the advantages garnered by the North Atlantic Bloc post-1492, when they were able to loot and plunder the Americas and enslave Africans. Fortunately, after about 500 years, that particular stage and epic of history is coming to a shuddering close, not least due to the Herculean efforts of the BRICS.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to ask you about several stories related to Iran. First, it was reported on July 5th by Western sources that Iran struck 5 Israeli Defense Force bases with just 6 ballistic missiles during the 12-day war. And this past Monday, July 7th, it was reported that Iran received Chinese surface-to-air missile batteries as Tehran rapidly moves to rebuild defenses destroyed by Israel during their recent 12-day conflict. Whereas the U.S. Defense Department held up a shipment of U.S. weapons earmarked for Ukraine this week over what U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said were concerns about its low stockpiles. It was further reported that this move to halt the weapons shipment blindsided the State Department, members of Congress, officials in Kyiv, and European allies. Dr. Horne, how should we be analyzing all of these reports?
Well, what's remarkable in my estimation is that in the New York Times just this past Monday, there was a banner headline and a front page story by the journalist Edward Long reporting the misinformation that Russia and China have turned their backs on Iran. Now, why the editors allowed that story to run is beyond me. It's befuddling. It's clear misinformation and disinformation. I'm not going to say I expected more from the New York Times, but certainly I think that they're misleading the investor class, which relies heavily upon this so-called paper of record, because China and Russia have every incentive to back Iran. That is to say, if the Islamic Republic is overthrown, it will provide impetus for U.S. imperialism to creep closer to the border of Russia, creep closer to the border of China. It will be a shot in the arm for U.S. imperialism, just like the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And I have to keep mentioning that that was backed by many of our friends on the left, was a stepping stone to the so-called 12-day war that just concluded a few weeks ago. I should also mention, in addition to what has just been on your screen, is that apparently Russia, China, and Iran have access to hypersonic missiles, which the United States does not have, which provides a mortal threat to U.S. aircraft carriers, a number of which have been cruising off the shores of Iran when they're not cruising off the shores of China. But these hypersonic missiles bid fair to turn these gigantic aircraft carriers into heaps of steel, that is to say, floating caskets for the sailors who are stuck on these vessels. Not only that, but drone technology, which is the latest innovation in terms of warfare, as the conflict in Ukraine tends to exemplify. China and Iran, to a degree, are ahead of the United States with regard to drones. If you look at Ukraine, which has had some success in using drones, a good deal of their drones come from Turkey. So once again, in terms of our ongoing theme for today, this is another demerit in the ledger of U.S. imperialism and North Atlantic imperialism. The fact that they are reporting that supposedly Israel attained this major victory with the so-called 12-day war, when even conservatives like Steve Bannon have been suggesting that Israel was suing for peace by late June, that they had run out of interceptor missiles, and there are hardliners in Iran that are rueing the fact that they decided to accept the ceasefire because they think they could have delivered a withering blow if the war continued to Israel. Which brings us to, once again, Mr. Netanyahu showing up in the White House and supposedly negotiating with regard to Gaza. Mr. Witkoff, the U.S. mediator with regard to that conflict, has delayed his trip to Doha. He delayed it today, which suggests that there is some sort of stumbling block with regard to getting a meeting of the minds between Hamas and Palestine and the Israeli authorities. In any case, I think it's fair to say that it will be a step forward when Israel is forced to accept this truce, not least because it will mean the release of hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian prisoners unjustly incarcerated. And at the same time, we should pay close and careful attention to the diabolical schemes of the Israelis and their U.S. patrons. In the Financial Times of London just a few days ago, there was a lengthy article about how Tony Blair, remember Tony Blair, the former prime minister of Great Britain, his consultancy has developed a plan that supposedly is putting meat on the bones concerning Mr. Trump's harebrained scheme to turn Gaza into sort of an equivalent of the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, or Abu Dhabi, etc., which of course raises a question as to what will happen to the Palestinians. Apparently, just as in North America, you had the indigenous population either liquidated, ditto, look at what's happening in Palestine on a daily basis, 50 to 100 killed on a regular daily basis for weeks now, or per this Blair plan, they will be swept into a corner of Gaza or be forced to move in to Egypt, the Sinai Desert, to Australia, Europe, perhaps North America. That is to say, they will be scattered to the four winds, which is fundamentally what happened to the indigenous population, although a good number of them wound up on so-called reservations where their descendants continue to reside. So clearly, we have a lot of work to do with regard to stopping the war machine in historic Palestine.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Ethiopia. On June 23rd, it was reported that the Somali government is fueling insecurity near the Ethiopian border. Similarly, on June 14th, the head of Ethiopia's armed forces, Birhanu Jula, warned that the deployment of Egyptian troops to neighboring Somalia poses a growing threat to Ethiopia's national security, amid heightened regional tensions. Speaking before the Ethiopian parliament, Birhanu Jula said that the presence of foreign forces in Somalia, while officially framed as cooperation, could undermine Ethiopia's sovereignty and regional stability. His comments come months after Egypt and Somalia signed a controversial military agreement in August 2024, allowing up to 10,000 Egyptian troops to be stationed in Somalia. Part of the Egyptian contingent is expected to operate under the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, while the rest will be directly under Egyptian command. Ethiopia has voiced growing concern over what it sees as a strategic encirclement by Egypt, particularly as the two countries remain at odds over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile River. On July 3rd, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which was launched in 2011 with a $4 billion budget, and is considered Africa's largest hydroelectric project stretching 1.8 kilometers, is now finally completed and will be officially inaugurated in September. While Ethiopia views the dam as a cornerstone of its development, Egypt fears it will threaten its vital water supply. And domestically, Ethiopia is facing a dire situation as 75% of the country is out of the government's control as insurgencies rage across the country. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to all the news out of Ethiopia, particularly when framed with a growing and troubling list of domestic and regional security issues that Ethiopia faces?
Well, certainly what this controversy raises is that we really need a deeper analysis of North Africa, because not only has Egypt acted as a kind of gendarme for imperialism, not to mention its own expansionist efforts, but you can say the same thing about its neighbor to the west. Speaking of Morocco, which, as you know, has gobbled up Western Sahara, the former Spanish colony, which is legally occupied by Morocco. And we should then, of course, realize that when there have been exceptions to this North African pattern, I'm thinking of G.A. Nasser, the leader of Egypt in the 1950s and the 1960s, the North Atlantic imperialists sick Israel on Nasser with regard to the so-called Six-Day War of 1967. And then when there's Mr. Gaddafi of Libya, he is overthrown by the North Atlantic countries in 2011. And so turning back to Egypt, we need, again, a deeper analysis. And I'd like to think that I'll be making a contribution to this deeper analysis, because in 2026, I'll be publishing this book that deals in part with the relations between Egypt and Ethiopia in the 19th century. Recall that in 1865, after the US Civil War, many of the defeated slave-owning generals and lieutenants fled to Cairo, where they then led an invasion of Ethiopia, which was repelled. Keep in mind as well, referencing the notion of the program Freedom Now, which I host on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, kpfk.org, that in a few weeks we'll be interviewing a scholar who goes into some detail about the rather harsh measures that Ethiopia has used, not only in its vicinity, in its neighborhood, but internally. That is to say, there has been an attempt by the Egyptian authorities to colonize Sudan. That goes back to the end of the 19th century. There has been an attempt by the Egyptian authorities to be critical of Black Americans. For example, you may be familiar with the film, the movie released at the behest of Jada Pinkett Smith, which portrayed Cleopatra as a woman with melanin. The Cairo authorities, you would think, have enough on their plate fighting poverty and confronting, we would hope, the Zionist expansionists, took time out to denounce this cinematic effort, not to mention criticizing the Black comic Kevin Hart for making reference to ancient Egyptian history, where, of course, the darker skinned Egyptians played more of a pivotal and instrumental role than they do today. And what's interesting about that is that even in the United States of America, besides Pinkett Smith and Kevin Hart, we see manifestations of this trend. That is to say that there is a tendency amongst certain Egyptian Americans to enter, or to be allowed to enter, the hallowed halls of whiteness. I'm thinking of Dina Habib Powell McCormick, a Republican Party operative, the spouse of Senator McCormick of Pennsylvania, a billionaire. We mentioned more than once the former host of the Today Show, a running buddy of the daughter of George W. Bush, she too being Egyptian American. And it also reminds me, speaking of Egypt's neighbors to the west, of what happened with regard to a son of Tunisia. Some of you might recall the former conservative Republican senator from the state of Virginia, Senator George Allen. That was the name he used. It turns out, after investigation, he was actually a son of Tunisia. In fact, a son of Jewish Tunisia. And his career began to plummet after that fact was revealed. And so, just as I suggested a moment or two ago that we need our Protestant friends to do a critique of this evangelical Protestant trend with regard to Brazil, we need our Muslim friends, our Arab American friends, our Egyptian American friends to really scrutinize carefully the role of Cairo, which is becoming more and more aggressive and harmful and baneful, particularly in the Horn of Africa. And this is nothing new This is a trend that stretches back decades, if not centuries. And one more footnote. It was revealed that of late, Mr. Trump has had a luncheon, a working lunch, with a number of West African leaders, including the leaders of Mauritania and Senegal and Guinea-Bissau and Gabon, etc. Liberia, too, I think, was included. And it's difficult for me to avoid the point that this has a lot to do with U.S. tensions with the Sahel states. That is to say, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. I would like to think that the recently inaugurated leader of Senegal will not want to participate in that scheme. Particularly, this is curious because Mr. Trump is notorious for referring to African nations as being so-called S-hole nations. And so the fact that he would take time out of his schedule to engage in breaking bread with these West African leaders, it says quite a bit, once again, about the theme for today, which is how the United States is trapped between means and ends. And so on the one hand, it leads to this erratic policy, denouncing African nations as S-hole nations on the one hand, and then trying to woo them on the other, because the Sahel nations are firmly in a relationship with Moscow, not least.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the news from Belgium. On July 1st, it was reported that Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Brussels, and both sides agreed to enhance mutual trust. Wang Yi stated that despite facing an intertwined international situation, that China and Europe are still enhancing communication, understanding, and mutual trust to become anchors of stability for the world and be reliable and strong partners that achieve mutual success. And de Wever stated that Belgium firmly believes in multilateralism and supports Europe in strengthening its autonomy, and looks forward to positive outcomes from the meeting of European and Chinese leaders. He emphasized that the Belgian government firmly adheres to the One China policy and will not change this stance. Dr. Horne, how should we be analyzing this meeting between the foreign ministers of Belgium and China that took place in Brussels last week?
Well, it's a reflection of this repetitive theme. That is to say, the U.S. would like to convert the European Union, which by some measures has an economy larger than that of the United States of America, certainly has a population larger than the United States, 340 million, but somehow Mr. Trump feels that the EU can be converted into a neo-colonial appendage. Now, I know why he thinks that, because if you look at certain EU members, starting with the giant that is Germany, not to mention the chihuahuas like the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, not to mention Poland, they're firmly in the grasp of US imperialism. But at the same time, there's enough momentum in the EU to try to break bread and cut deals with the Chinese leadership, because Mr. Trump, once again, is trying to punish and pulverize key European Union industries with these suffocating tariffs, leaving Brussels with few alternatives but to turn towards China. In this regard, I should mention, which something we should have mentioned weeks ago, which is China has just cut a deal with African nations with regard to zero tariffs. That is to say, no tariffs with regard to African exports into the Chinese market. At the same time, back to the EU, at the NATO summit in the Netherlands just a few days ago, Mr. Trump was able to muscle through this notion that the European Union nations should contribute 5% of their economy to the U.S. military industrial complex. That is to say, to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing. Obviously, this is going to be very harmful. You see that Prime Minister Starmer in Great Britain might not be in office much longer, because he has tried to cultivate Mr. Trump, and therefore has sought to cut welfare benefits to British nationals so that Britain can meet this 5% benchmark. And so, once again, to conclude, the problem for U.S. imperialism right now is that there is a disconnect between means and ends. On the one hand, it wants to assure U.S. imperial dominance. That's the end, that's the goal. But it's unclear if they have the means to do so. In fact, it's fair to say that U.S. imperialism is trapped in what many historians have called imperial overstretch. That is to say, they cannot necessarily afford to continue to arm Israel, to confront Iran, to back Taiwan in its confrontation with China, and to back Ukraine in its confrontation with Russia. Apparently, the Ukrainian, if previous headlines are any indication, will be the first nation that's thrown overboard, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.